Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining me in this lecture on traditional farming and sustainability. At the beginning, I would like to thank Dr. Rhonda for allowing me to be part of the course on agricultural sustainability. This lecture will cover some aspects of traditional farming practices and how they are related to sustainability. So let's get started. So what is actually the definition of sustainability? There are a few things that we need to understand about sustainability. For example, is there actually anything that can be defined as sustainable? And then what is the actual practice of farming that makes it sustainable? And how is that related to traditional farming? Do you count traditional farming as sustainable? How different traditional farm from conventional or modern farm? How sustainable traditional compared to modern farming? Is farming in Oman considered traditional in the way it is now? What can we learn from traditional farming for sustainability? These are some of the things that we'll be talking about throughout this lecture. And so we'll start, for example, by definition of sustainability. You have taken this course for a few weeks already, so you have a very clear idea on sustainability. When you go look for definition of sustainability, everyone is seem to be talking about sustainability. Everything from oil companies to governments to non-profit organizations to any kind of practice that is out there, everyone is talking, this is going to be sustainable, we will make it sustainable, and this is part of sustainability plan, and so on. So what is sustainability? I would like to do a Google search on what is sustainability, and this is what we get. It says it is very complex concept. It's not simple. Probably that's why everyone is using it. Some people use it, some people abuse it. So the most often quoted definition comes from the UN Brundtland Commission, and sustainability or sustainable development is development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is balancing between meeting the current needs of current population or generation without affecting the future generation needs. So that is a definition or one of the definitions that are commonly cited for sustainability. Now, when it comes to agricultural sustainability, in terms of a definition, it's also unclear. But in general, it is the production of anything related to agriculture. That includes production of food, whether that's plant-based food or animal-based or marine-based, any kind of food, fiber, or other plant or animal products using farming techniques that, what are the criteria? Protect the environment, consider public health, human communities, as well as animal welfare. This is one of the definitions out there on sustainability. So here it's talking about the practice of agriculture that respects the environment, respects humans as well as animals, or whatever resource that you are going to be using for food production. Now, for a clearer definition on how this integrates as a practice, comes from a bill in the United States to define sustainable agriculture as integrated system. It has to be integrated, so it is integrated system of plant and animal production practices having a site-specific application that will do what? Over long term. Sustainability is not about short term, it is about long term. These long term factors or goals include satisfying human food and fiber needs. So satisfying human needs from agricultural products, enhance environmental quality, and the natural resource base upon which agricultural economy depends. So there's enhancement of the environment. There's also the most efficient use of non-renewable resources. That includes the soil, the water, any resource that's been used, the fisheries, for example, or even in animals and plants. Then sustain the economic viability of farm operation, because without this, it's not going to be sustainable. Farming is highly dependent on natural resources, but also it is an economic activity. And if that economic viability is not sustained, the farming in itself cannot be sustainable. And finally, enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. This practice of farming in itself would have to reflect positively on the farmers as well as on the society. So these are the elements of sustainability. It includes the environment as its space, whether we are talking about natural resources or the environment in general, as well as the community, whether it is talking about consumers or producers, farmers or the community, as well as the economic validity of the agricultural production by itself. So all these factors come into place when we talk about agricultural sustainability. Now, how traditional farming come into play with the concept of sustainability? Many of you probably are aware that in Oman, a lot of the farming is actually traditional in its nature. That what is traditional? Now we have to define what is traditional first. The traditional, we put it in one place compared to other practices. So this is traditional agriculture. You can see some of the forms of traditions in date palm production. You can see it in wheat production, okay, and then many other crops, even forage and pasture crops like alfalfa, grasses, date palm, other fruit trees. Compare that to hydroponic, greenhouse production, and machinery production or machinery dependent production, and that is modern agriculture. Then we don't really have much of the industrial agriculture in Oman due to the limited land resources and water resources, but this is different from modern agriculture. This is huge monocropping that is, taking up large areas, huge amount of resources, and also huge chemical inputs, whether those are for fertilizers or they are for pesticides. So these are the three types of farming or agriculture that we will be talking about. Now, to be clear on what's the difference between them and which one is more sustainable. When we talk about modern, including the industrial, this includes the industrial as well. So it's not just, it's not the only the more, يعني it means this is industrial زائد conventional farming. So I'm including both of them in this definition of modern. Whereas traditional is, let's call it old style farming. So modern is, what's the difference? The most obvious difference is high chemical input here, whether those, especially for fertilizers and pesticides, as opposed to traditional when you have a low chemical input. This is very clear. So chemical is one thing. So we have chemical input. That is one thing. And the other one is high energy use. So most of the modern agriculture, most of the conventional agriculture is mechanized. They require tons of energy, huge energy to run all the operation. And that includes irrigation systems, include machinery, tractors, harvesters, all kinds of machinery. So it needs a lot of energy. On the other hand, the traditional systems don't require much energy. Why? Because most of the operations are done manually or using animals, like, for example, plowing of the land. So you don't need a tractor here. You need a blower. You have to have an ox or an animal. Then that will be the one to be used. A lot of the operations from planting to harvesting also doesn't require any mechanized operations. It is done manually. So that's why it is low energy input. Another thing is, usually the area and the crop in itself is different. In industrial or modern farming, you have intense monocropping. Mono means huge areas are planted with one crop. Whereas here you can see diversity, you see multiple crops at multi-story. Multi-story means you have a date palm. Under the date palm, you will find a lime tree here, and then you also find alfalfa or some grass as animal feed. So this is called multi-story farming. This is characteristics of traditional farming. And then at the end, the yield is also a factor because you are growing large areas with one crop. Here you will have higher yield per unit area from that crop, whereas here you have low to moderate yield per crop. Obviously, in the traditional farmers or farming system, you will have more than one crop to be harvested, and so it can be moderate. But in general, because of the structure of the farm, you have very low to moderate yield. Of course, the inputs are also low in terms of chemicals, energy are very low. And so as a result, the yield will also be low in traditional farming. So the question is back again, which system is more sustainable? Okay. You may agree or disagree that maybe traditional farming systems are more sustainable because for thousands of years, these systems have been working with very little impact on their own system as a system of farming or the environment. Whereas in modern farms, we have seen the results in terms of large areas that are suffering desertification, salinity, loss of biodiversity, damaging to the water resources, damage to the soil. All of that is associated with modern farm. But at the same time, huge increase in population also requires huge production characterized by the yield. So the efficiency here is what? How much is produced per unit area? Of course, in this sense, modern farms are better because they produce better yield per unit area. Whereas in traditional farms, they have less yield per unit area. Let's look at example of traditional farmers that are in Oman. For example, if you go to Jabal Akhdar, you will see pomegranate grown in terraces. Why? Because this is mountainous area where there's no flat lands, you can grow any kind of crop on it. So farmers over the time adapted and started to cultivate crops in terraces. That's what happens in Al Jabal Akhdar. And now, not only they grow it, they were able to import or develop cultivars, different cultivars. Why is that? Because of the risk. Because one dependency on one cultivar, you maybe have a disease that will destroy the whole cultivar. You also want to extend the season, so you have these cultivars have ripe fruits at different times of the year. So you have sustainable food for some time throughout the year. The same time where the water come from. Remember, the land is actually terraces, okay? And so the water comes from Falaj. For example, Falaj al-Aziz, if you see, okay? That's one example. So the water is imported from other resources, from springs, from under, the mountain aquifers. That's where the water come from to the farms in Jabal Akhdar. There are also small plots. So each one sometimes own only 1 to 3 trees. And because the villages are very small, the nature of the place, the small amount of water that's available, so that render the farms to be also small. The fertilizers will come only from within the small oasis because it will be very expensive to bring it from outside of the mountain. So most of the fertilizer used is manure. A lot of the pest also using biocontrol methods of controlling pests and diseases. The harvesting is manual, no mechanical, of course, and there is no post-harvest processing, or most of the fruit is sold immediately. And when there is a post-harvest storage, it is basically storing the pomegranate in a small room that is cooled, and that's about it. There is no refrigeration required. There is no energy in terms of transport. So you can see this is a typical traditional farm where you have low energy, low chemical, and diverse cropping system. Okay, so this is very typical of traditional farming examples in Oman. And you can see here, this is basically where the terraces are that are shown here in the picture. You can see these are the terraces. Some of the terraces are not always cultivated, whether they are left as fallow intentionally or because the amount of water is not adequate to plant all the terraces. And some of these terraces are also left uncultivated, so it will restore. By the next year, it will be cultivated. And some of these terraces also used for vegetables, like garlic, for example, or for pastures, like wheat, corn, or some animal feed. So this is where they are. And you can see the houses are in one location on top of the mountain. And then you have all the terraces that are built traditionally to grow cultivars of different kinds, like you see here. And this is now the harvested fruit that has been sold out immediately in the mountain itself or in the vicinity, like, for example, in Nizwa market. So this is the traditional agricultural cultivation of pomegranate in Oman. Now let's look at another crop, that is the date palm, which is very common. Much of the date palm is grown in the northern plains of Oman. There are a huge number of cultivars. Remember, even though the pomegranate is very little area, like Jabal Akhdar, it is more than 5 to 7 cultivars that are there. So imagine date palm that's grown everywhere in Oman. Obviously, there will be much more cultivars than a few of them. So they reach over 200, both male and female. They are also irrigated with village or sometimes by wells. Same thing, they are small in plots as well. So even that applies to date palm in the traditional sense of cultivation. Same thing, manure is used, and many of the date palm farmers would have animals like goats and sheep and so on. So they use the manures for that, for their traditional farms. Pest control at the local level used to be biological. But then, Dubas bug, for example, now is not at the farmer's control. They don't make the decision on controlling Dubas bug, for example. It is the government that make that decision, and they actually spray chemicals. So that disturbed the sustainability of traditional date palm cultivation of Oman. And then you can think about what is the impact of using chemicals on these systems. So here we have chemical pesticides on the system itself, on the traditional farming systems, especially in terms of controlling the Dubas bug. However, other practices, like for example, harvesting is still manual. There is no post-harvest processing as well. For the most part, the farmers would harvest and then dry up the dates outside in the sun and then sell them in local markets or store them for their own use. Obviously, for date palm, they can be consumed at different stages. They can be consumed as bisr, as rotab, as tamar. So there is a variety of times where date can be consumed in Oman in the traditional farming system. But in the conventional modern systems, no. The focus is production of tamar, which is the last stage, this one here, for the purpose of manufacturing, processing, as well as export. Dates, even pomegranates actually, can be stored for a long time, and so storage is really traditional, and it is well known in the country that these dates used to be stored in actually a product of the date palm leaves itself. So these small baskets are used to store dates for the rest of the year. And here is an example of a traditional farming system that involves the date palm. And you can see date palm is a major crop in Oman. It's actually the largest fruit crop in Oman. It constitutes 80% of all fruit produced in the country, and it is a huge significance. Almost 50% of all agriculture in Oman is actually date palm. So date palm, although it's not the only one, because as I mentioned, in traditional farming system, there is multi-story farming where you have the date palm on top, then you have fruit trees here, for example, another fruit is mango, lime, guava, and so many others. So you have the uh, date palm here, and then you have another crop that's lower than the date palm, and then you have a third crop here. And so this is like sugarcane, for example. This is grasses, wheat, and alfalfa, a variety of crops that can be grown. So this is called multi-story farming system, which is atypical of traditional farms, as I mentioned. And so there is a variety of date palm that is being produced. Now, when it comes to the natural resources that are required for the traditional farmers and their use, there is usually abundance or adequate amount of water for the purpose of the farming that is present or being used. For example, this is the dam that is in Wadi Dhiqa, and that's in Muscat actually, in Qurayat. And so this um, water resource is huge, right? And it is now being safe to recharge the aquifers, and that's also affected positively on the amount of water available in a flags, in wells, although some may argue this is really not a sustainable way or an environmentally friendly way, because down the stream other farms and other naturally growing plants will be affected by holding the water, as well as losing some of that water to evapotranspiration. So what the older generations did to preserve water. What we have to look first at the bigger picture. As you can see, Oman, just like in any other countries, is water deficit. That means you can see here the amount of rainfall is very little. So these countries use plenty of water for agriculture. It can reach to 70 to 80% of the water in agriculture, in farming, whereas we get the least amount of rain, and also we get the least amount per capita in the world. So that is not unusual, because still 70 or to 80% of the world fresh water is actually used for agriculture, and it's being recycled, because when you eat a tomato or another kind of fruit, you eat basically 90% of water that came from the water resources wherever it is. So if you are exporting fruits and vegetables, you are technically exported 90% of your own water. And there's a definition for that that is called virtual water. And I suggest that you look into this definition of virtual water and try to actually understand what it means and how it relates to agriculture and sustainability. Overuse of water and also increase of um, or lack of rainfall or extended periods of drought led to many farms, especially traditional farms, to be abandoned. And so a lot of these date palms have died because of drought. On the other hand, water use, because of the introduction of new machines, introduction of water pumps, electricity, have led to huge extraction of water from the aquifers and the intrusion of seawater, leading to salinity. So this is caused by salinity, and this is caused by drought. So whether there is a shortage of water because of quantity, and that is drought, for example, shortage of rainfall, climate change, all these factors, or it is caused by human intervention and that is the extraction of large amount of water, then led to salinity. At the end of the day, both of these conditions will be destroying the sustainability of traditional farming systems. Let's talk a little bit about the water resources in Oman. There are about 167,000 wells in the country, and these are mostly in Al-Batin area. That's where the salinity issue is more clear. Also in the Salalah coastal area. So most of the coastal areas are actually wells. Using or extracting the water in large quantities from these areas have led to salinity. Okay, we have about 4,000 villages throughout the country, and most of this is around Hajar Mountain, most of them. And so whether it is the northern Hajar or southern Hajar or eastern and western Hajar. So the Hajar Mountain is, is the Jebel Shams, Jebel Akhdar, all the way to Musandam on both sides. So it's about 3,000 of these villages are actually operational. About 1,000 is called dead. They no longer function, but they are there. And the area irrigated by village constitute 26,000, about 26,000 hectares irrigated by a flood. About 66% of these of this land is actually cultivated with crops. So you can see there's a large amount of land that is irrigated by the traditional village irrigation system that cannot be substituted with wells. Okay, so Oman, because of its location in a drier, arid or semi-arid climate, it suffers from drought, suffers from shortage of rainfall. Actually, average rainfall in Oman is about 100 millimeters per year. On the other hand, there is high water loss. So there is shortage of rainfall and there is an increase in evapotranspiration because the country is very hot. It is in an arid and semi-arid region. And so a lot of water is being lost. You can see that it is, if you get an average of 100 millimeters of rain per year, you are actually losing up to 2,000 millimeters per year. So a huge difference between what we get is like 10 to 20 fold what we lose by evapotranspiration. And of course, lack of water management have always yielded into disasters, including salinity. And we should not forget that water is not only for agriculture, but also it's important for human consumption as well. So there is always continuous demand. There is also industrial needs for water. So there are other aspects of water, not just for agriculture, although agriculture take about 70 to 80% of our water. Still, there is an increase in demand every year because of the increase in population that continue to rise. If you remember, we used to be 2 million, now we are about 4 million individuals. These people require water. So there is an increase in the needs for water. And that's why we have water deficit of about 300 million cubic meter nowadays. So it's huge water deficit. The amount of water available does not cover for that. And so this is every year we have a deficit that is huge and we cannot compensate it from any other source of water. Actually, of all the water issues, when you look at the assessment trends, in terms of modernizing the agricultural system, greenhouses, modern irrigation systems, these kind of things help. They are very good for us and we get not a bad scale, above average. Same thing for drinking water supply. Oman has a reliable, sanitized, clean drinking water to meet the demand, domestic demand of the population. There is also water intensity used in the industry, even though it's used we don't have too much industry that dependent on water a lot, but the efficiency is very high for water use in the industry. And also the governance, there are a whole bunch of laws and regulations and strategies that are in place in the country that takes care of this part. Our biggest concern is this one here. So this is, we are scoring very low in terms of environmental and ecosystem health because the continuous use of unregulated water extraction from the aquifer and the effects of salinity has been a problem, as well as the deterioration of the quality of irrigation water. So acidity of the water, salinity of the water, increased heavy metal in the water, use of agrochemicals. All these issues are problematic in terms of the farming systems that is related to water use. So although we have modernized agriculture, we have good irrigation system, we have safe drinking water, we have efficient industrial use of water, but we have an issue with the environment and the ecosystem health. So now, if we look at the land, we don't actually, much of the land is the same, just like deforestation. If we look at deforestation, for example, deforestation is linked to water use because the deforestation, the more you move trees, the more problems you have in the water resources and also in traditional farming. So much of the forests in the world in general, not only in Oman, but also worldwide, because we are impacted by the amount of water and deforestation that happen in other countries. We are also affected by it. So much of the land has been um, gone or destroyed, whether for oil palm, like in the case of Indonesia, for farming, or for any other use. Much of the deforestation actually worldwide happened, and that affected the sustainability of agricultural production because of the subsistence farming. So a lot of the deforestation worldwide, removal of the forests, including the Amazon, is meant for subsistence farming. Is this only in the forest area? No, even in Oman and Dhofar, as well as in Jabal Akhdar and other areas, removal of these natural habitat and the the forest also made room for farming, and that farming is subsistent. That means not industrial, not commercial like this one. So it's only a third of the deforestation is actually because of commercial agriculture. Large part of it, half of it, is because of subsistence farming. And when you think about deforestation, you think about logging, or because of the wood. That's why they do the deforestation. They are not. They are doing it because of agriculture, and it's not because of the wood. So a large amount of forest areas worldwide is being removed because of the farming and not any other reason. So now, whether in Oman or worldwide, what's the impact of deforestation? Remember, deforestation will yield desertification. So the more deforestation you do, the more desertification you will have. So the consequences, of course, now we are suffering from already atmospheric or climatic changes, including global warming due to greenhouse gas emissions, which is about 20% of that, and CO2 emissions, which is 12%. Remember, plants will absorb CO2. So if you remove plants, no one will absorb CO2. You'll continue to release CO2 in the atmosphere. And you can see all these figures. You can go back to references and actually look at the data. There is continuous increase of CO2 worldwide. So this is continuous over time. For many years now, CO2 has been on the rise. Also, deforestation will impact hydrological change. 30% of the planet, actually, water is linked to forests, and that is worldwide. Deforestation, as I mentioned, it has to do with soil degradation. It results in soil erosion and desertification. So this is also linked, desertification, and we are suffering from this problem. And I suggest you also look into this. What is reasoning or what is causing desertification? What causes it in Oman? Can this be resolved? Can this be stopped? Can this be reversed? In addition to deforestation issues or desertification, there is, remember, we have biodiversity loss, and that impact, I will get to it later in terms of crops, but in general, until today, we lose 137 species per day on average because of various reasons, including and mostly because of deforestation. The economic and soil impact on the local inhabitants, the people who live in the forest, is also tremendous. Remember, there is huge amount of deforestation that is expected to reach 80% of the world forest will be cleared by 2030. Okay, so that's an overview of the international status of what are the reasons that contribute to the lack of sustainability in agricultural systems, and how is that related to traditional farming systems. Now we look at the food, the people, and the environment. These three things are actually linked. They cannot be dealt with separately. So if you are going to meet the demand of the people in terms of food, but you also have to balance that with the preservation of the environment. So you have, there is a need, there's a food need here, and there's the environment on the other hand. This is very important equation. World population is increasing, local population is increasing, but there's also an increase on the impact, increase in CO2. At the end of the day, if you don't do the balance, what you are going to happen or you have is self-destruction. You will destroy your own self. So eventually, because you live in one system, one large greenhouse, you will destroy your own self if you continue unbalancing the need of food with the sustainable use of the renewable resources such as the soil and the water. This is an agro-ecosystem and will have to be dealt that way because for agricultural production to succeed, it will require other resources like water, soil, insect, animals. It will also have to consider the air quality, pollution, energy, organic matter in the soil, human activity, other creatures like animals, birds, marine life, all of it in one system. So all these conditions have to be looked at in its entirely and not separately. So you cannot look at these systems, which we call basically environment, and then which one is it, the food or the environment, and how to balance these two. So because they are linked and they are caused because it is a system and because it is one life, this has to be balanced. Now let's give some ideas of what we can do. Now we understand the complexity of agriculture and sustainability and farm production. What can we do? And this is a picture from Salala, where, as you know, in Kharif, you see the whole mountains as green everywhere. And also, traditionally, people have been cultivating a variety of crops during this season. First, we have to learn, and I think I cannot emphasize this enough. Indigenous knowledge is extremely important. Okay, so المعرفة التقليدية, indigenous knowledge. This is very important, and this is the key to being sustainable. These systems have been there, they have existed for a longest time, thousands of years. And if it is not sustainable, it is not going to continue all these years. So we have to go back, understand these systems, learn from them, and then apply that to our current practices in agriculture. When we look at the land, people have used these terraces but because of the imbalance, people have managed to use flat lands to grow wheat. For example, this is in Musandam. Okay, so in Musandam, they managed to do wheat cultivation depending on what? On rain. Okay, so when there was rain during the winter, they would cultivate wheat during the winter season, and they will harvest it in 2 months or 3 months from these lands. So if you go in the mountains, you always see these flat lands. Also in the mountains, as I showed you in Jabal Akhdar, there is these terraces, but also in Wadi Sahtan, in some other areas on Hajar Mountain, both of it east and west, you always see these kind of terraces that are built to grow other crops such as date palm. Of course, any change in the agro-ecosystem, like disturbance of water, will result into destruction of the system. But in terms of land availability, this is very efficient use of the land that we need to learn from. Also, the practices itself, not just the resources. So soil is there, water is there, the land is there, but what are the current practices, the farming practices itself that will make these sustainable for thousands of years? For example, the system of the relationship between where the people live and where the farms are, the kind of farming they do, date palms, other fruit trees, natural wild plants, and then areas that are being cultivated, areas that are not being cultivated, all these systems and the crops they do, how they harvest them, how they collect the seed, how they have also other kind of um, resources like honeybees and so on. So all this is integrated into one system. That's called the farming system. So the traditional farming system is very important, and also it will teach us a lot on sustainability. The biodiversity that is linked to these farming systems is very important to understand and assess our biodiversity. For example, as I mentioned, there's more than 200 date palm cultivars in Oman. There is also a huge variety of animals as well, and a huge um, variety of crop biodiversity. For example, legumes. You can see here different kinds of wheat, barley, lentil, all kinds of fruits and vegetable seeds that are preserved by the locals for many generations. And so these may not be highly productive, but they can be tolerant to diseases, they can be tolerant to heat stress, they can require less water, less management. And so there is something in these resources that needs to be explored. Remember, during these times, 30% of livestock worldwide, they are close to extinction. So these resources are not going to be there forever. 75% of crop genetic diversity already lost since 1900. And so sooner or later, the commercial cultivars will take over. These wild or natural or agricultural land races, cultivars, are going to be lost over time. And so it's very important to start now to collect them and then preserve them for future generations. And as you can see here, in one of the studies, only in one location, you have about 10 cultivars of wheat, or land races basically. So this is wheat, and you can see the traditional farming system of wheat. It's huge, and these cultivars or these land races require plenty of studies to see where wheat is cultivated, what are these people doing, where did they bring them from, what are the characteristics of these cultivars. All these are important questions that needs to be answered in terms of traditional farming system and their collection of genetic resources that are used for food and agriculture. As I mentioned again, these resources are not going to be there forever. They are very, very rare and very only kept by the elderly until now and traditional farmers. So this has to be passed to future generations. And you can see the method of preservation itself is extremely traditional. So it's not transferred to a new generation. It's not going to be moved to a new generation. It's going to be lost. This is going to be a resource that's not going to be continued forever, and therefore preservation is very much important of local genetic resources. So this is very important for us in terms of crops or agriculture, or even in both the crops as well as the animals as well. One more thing on traditional farming. Traditional farming does not, as I mentioned before, and I got to this before, that it's not just the farm, but also the surrounding environment, the other resources that are available within the system. And that's why farmers will keep trees, selected type of trees that will be there for their food use. Like, for example, this is cedar, this is Spina Christi, Ziphus. So this is Ziphus, this is, for example, boot, and this is Nimt. Okay, so there is a whole variety of this is Daja, this is Sidaf. So this is only example of fruit plants that are wild, that have plenty of food uses. So when there is shortages of food from the farm, usually the locals will resort to wild plants and wild trees for both food and medicine. And therefore, the study and the link of these natural resources and how they are related to the farming systems are also extremely important. Finally, to conclude this presentation, and I hope I covered all these aspects of sustainability in the traditional farming system, and I had also highlighted a few things that will affect the traditional farming system, like climate change, deforestation, desertification, and how they are linked to the system or farming system, even though we are local, but we are affected by international or what would happen globally in terms of, as I mentioned, climate change, disasters, natural disasters, and all this, especially nowadays when the world is a small, actually, village, what happens in one corner of the globe, as you all know, like now we are in the COVID-19 problem, it affects everyone on the planet. And therefore, we need to look at this on a global sense. And then we have to go back and look and learn from experience, learn from indigenous knowledge, not only on our own knowledge, but also from international indigenous knowledge. Also, we need to understand the efficiency of food production to be raised, but it will not be on the expense of the environment, on the expense of other elements of nature. And that requires plenty of research and technology, innovation, and therefore it's extremely important that we link research with the practical aspect of production more food for more people as the demand is increasing, while preserving the environment and learning from indigenous knowledge. Next is support innovation in sustainable food production, and that's very important. Support school and community and home gardens, and I believe the basis for understanding the importance of food that comes to the plate for our kids, for the community, would have to be on understanding the relationship between the plants and the person himself, or the community, or the school children. All of this would have to be done through increased gardening, the concept of being closer to the land and to the environment. Finally, or before the final point, we need to focus on trying to buy as much as we can locally, sustainably grown food. With that, I mean all the food that follow the healthy practices like organic food, but also natural food, also food that are in the local area, because the more you buy from your local community, the less the food will have to travel from far away to come to you. So you need to have that kind of culture where your local food is priority over long distance food. Finally, we need to focus on very important aspect aspect of sustainability, which is food waste and food loss, that constitute huge amount of food being wasted or lost. Almost 30% of all the food to 40% in Oman are actually wasted. And so try to reduce, take what you need, and leave the rest for others. So with this, I end up my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you actually visit this place. It's very one spot village that's not far from Muscat, from the university, and it can show you a variety of crops that are grown there, and also you can see the relationship between humans, animals, plants, and also nature or the environment. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm available on all social media sites, as well as I can be reached by email, or you can visit me at the Department of Plant Sciences at Sultan Qaboos University. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you good luck and goodbye.